Hello and welcome to the Baselight Learning Program. These are the free weekly online training sessions. And as before, we plan to have them the same time every week. So it'll be Tuesday at four o'clock London time. This time we're now using version 6 software. Um, we've released version 6 for the main Baselight systems, and we'll be releasing a version 6 Baselight look very soon. Now, before we start, I'll introduce you to some of the other members of our training team who are here today. There's Andy, who'll be actually taking today's session, Laura, and Victor. And they'll both be taking some of the sessions over the coming months. Now, as always, this session is going to be recorded. So afterwards, they'll be available on our website in the video section and also on YouTube, where you'll be able to leave comments and ask questions. So, oh, and one other thing I should mention is we're hoping at some point over the next few months to have some guest colorists coming in and taking a couple of these sessions. And they'll be able to share some of their tips and tricks and a few secrets on how they use Baselight. So that's quite exciting. Anyway, I'll hand over to Andy, who's going to be taking today's session, and I will see you all again soon.
Thank you, Bob, for the nice introduction. I'm very excited myself being the first presenter of a new Baselight version 6 feature. And today I'm starting with curve grade, and that was a really specific decision that I made to start with curve grade because I felt a little bit sad for the poor guy because in Baselight until Baselight version 5 and 4 and so curve grade was not among the most popular operators among our users, and I have to admit also myself I was only using it in very rare cases if I could not find another solution. And now with version 6 I was afraid that curve grade might then get not the spotlight it deserves. And that's why I thought, let's start with curve grade and show the amazing capabilities that we put into it. And also we wanted to show that we are constantly re-evaluating existing tools in Baselight and reworking them from the ground up to bring them up to the modern requirements of modern workflows, etc., etc. Curve grade in Baselight version 6 has been completely reworked. It has significant improvements in the user interface, but the biggest changes were made under the hood. It now relies on optimized color models for the specific tasks, and it is completely integrated in Baselight's powerful color management. In today's session, I will cover the master RGB and Y curves. In another session, I will then cover the remaining curves based on hue, saturation, and exposure. When we look at the UI, you can see that all the curves now have histograms of the current image as a background, which makes the usage of the curves much easier. Once we modify a curve, it is then underlined in yellow, as you can see here. This makes it easy for you to see what is going on. The curves have important reference points overlaid with these blue dotted lines here. One is the black point, which is scene linear 0. One is the gray point, which is 18% gray. And then we also have diffuse white, which means scene linear 1.0, or in simple terms, the brightness of a white piece of paper in the scene. Curve grade derives these values automatically through the color management. Okay, let's have a closer look at the new color model of the master RGB and Y curve. And to understand the improvements better, let's flip back to a shot set up in the old style of the curve grade. So here the master curve is now applied in the stack color space, which is a modern log working color space. We identified several issues when people try grading with curves in such a log working color space. One is that the gray, the mid-gray, and the diffuse white point are quite close together to accommodate a huge range here for the specular highlights. And that means that typical scenes like this one here only use that small part of the tonal range. Now let's add a point at 18% gray on the curve and move that one up and down on the y-axis. We can see that this shift here does not really have a similar effect as a gamma change would have, for example, on a Rec. 709 image, but this feels more like, let's say, closer to an exposure change. So when we make the image brighter, we can see we're then pushing it into the soft clip. And when we're darkening the image, we're then quickly starting to lose here details in the shadows. So that's also not really behaving that great. Let's reset that curve and try something else. Let's put another timer point here on middle gray, and let's try to roll off these highlights here a little bit with our master curve. And what we can see is that doing RGB or master curve tweakings in such a log space, it's very easy to create these very super flat regions. It's not already solarization, but we're getting close to it. So that can look very quickly quite unnatural when we do these kind of operations with the curve. Let's compare that to the new default mode in the new curve grade. So I'm doing the same. First, I'm adding a point here to middle gray, and now let's move it up and down on the mid gray axis. And what you should see is that the image much more behaves like what we would expect from such a bended curve here. So if we pull it down, yeah, the image gets more contrasty, more similar to a gamma operation, for example, in Rec. 709. And also notice here that we're not losing details in the blacks, we're just crunching them together. And when we're brightening the image, it's also not overexposing it that quickly. Okay, so let's try the other thing here by rolling off the highlights. So if I push really hard, then we can also get such an effect, but I have to really push much harder here on the highlights. So you should see that you have a much more natural response here working with the curve in this new color model. Okay, so what is the master curve actually doing? The master curve is applying the same operation to the R, G, and B channels all at the same time. So basically the master curve is RGB under the hood. And here with the R, G, and B curves, we can go into the individual color channels, which we will do in a moment. And the Y curve is then here to modify the luminance axis individually on the image. We will have a look at that later. Okay, let's reset that curve here and move on to the next shot. There's another point of improvement that we identified in curve grade. We noticed that working on a display referred image, in that case here, I converted the image directly to 2.4 gamma Rec. 709 in the stack, has a better response in the curves, and also it applies a special look to the image. Look here what happens in the chromaticity diagram when I do work with the curves natively on a Rec. 709 image. You can see that tendency of hue shifts towards the Rec. 709 primaries, etc. This has a very special look and feel to working with the curves, and we notice that this is usually preferable compared to a typical feel doing the same operations in a log working color space, as I showed before. So if we go into a scene referred pipeline here, so now we're grading again in T-log EGA mode 2, and first I will show the legacy mode in curve grade. So this is how it behaved up until version 6. We can see again these problems with very sensitive reaction. Also, we don't see that specific look here on the chromaticity diagram, but in the new default mode of the new curve grade, you should see so that it now has much more of the similar tendency of doing these specific hue shifts, and also that it overall should feel almost as working on a Rec 709 image with a curve. Although, of course, we're never clamping the signal anywhere. We're still doing everything in a clean scene referred way. We just use a new optimized color space here under the hood, like let's call it like a relaxed lock that is really optimized to do this master and RGB and luminance curve work on the image, to have the best of both worlds, the response and the feeling of, let's say, the Photoshop curves on an image, but maintaining the full dynamic range and scene referred character as you would usually expect from all the tools in Baselight. Okay, so now let's recap the differences between these 4 first shots here regarding the color management. Here on this shot here, I use the curve grade in default mode. So we're in a scene referred space, and I did not set the use stack RGB color space. That means curve grade uses its new optimized space under the hood for the RGB master and Y curves. The second shot here was the same. So here again, we were in a scene referred color space and we used curve grade in the default mode. On the very first shot, the only thing I changed here was ticking that check mark, use stack RGB color space. You can see that when I uncheck this, now we're using the new optimized color model. If I check this, now we're applying the curve really in the stack color space at that point in the stack. So here it's, for example, log 3G10, but I could also switch this, for example, to a Cineon log space, so then we can see here this histogram now and these gray, white and black points. Or let's choose, for example, log C4, which is also a modern log color space with a huge headroom here in the highlights, for example, for specular highlights. But our recommendation is keep this unchecked unless you need to do a specific operation in a specific color space. Then we have the third example here where I worked in Rec 709. So when curve grade detects that the image is now in a display referred color space, it will then also not convert into its optimized model, which is scene referred. So it's not going back to scene referred and then again back to display referred, but it maintains the image in the display referred space, in that case here, Rec 709. And that option here is now grayed out because it does not have any effect. All operations are applied in the stack color space. So here we're now really doing the curves as we would do them in, for example, Photoshop. Curve grade works in floating point and does not clamp the signal. So what happens if the image content goes beyond the normal 0 to 1 scene referred range on an image? This shot here has an extremely high dynamic range, and we can see that the histogram and the signal is going beyond 1.0 in the working space. Then we can just zoom out here on the curve to get the whole range into the working area of curve grade. So now we can move our highlight point here, for example, and of course we can even add more points here on the curve all the way up to the upper bound of the floating point range. So you can really completely work the whole curve in the whole floating point range. You can pan and zoom the curve in the same way you can pan and zoom the image here in the viewer. Also, the curve now has a home zoom button, which brings you back to the default range of the curve. If we want to make that image with very high dynamic range super dark, let's reset the curve for a moment. We can just remove the X lock of the points and then take that point here, for example, and take it all the way down on the Y-axis. That should make the tool convenient for specific high dynamic range tasks and should of course also make it future-proof. With the log X positions toggle turned on, when you add a point, it is locked then to the specific position here on the x-axis. Note that you can also here enter a specific value with the edit control point text box here. So if we want to put that point on 0.8, we can just bring it here. When we uncheck the log x positions, then we can move each point freely on the x and y axis. If you prefer to have this option turned off, then you can set this here in the Customize menu. Okay, let's have a quick look at the panel mapping of Curve Grade. So if you have a grading panel connected to your Baselight machine, then you can just start touching individual points here on the encoders to adjust their position on the curve. So here I can move the highlight point upwards to cover a larger range, or I can go to the shadow point and pull that one down. And if I want to tweak the points in between, as soon as I touch and move in one of the encoders, Baselight automatically adds points at the respective positions. And so this, I think, is a very convenient way to build like a custom contrast curve for a shot. So here, let's fine tune the shadows a little bit more and maybe lower our middle point here, etc. There are also bump buttons below the encoders, so you can also move each point up and downwards in bumps. Some people prefer to have these default points added to every new curve that they add automatically, and you can set this here again in the Customize menu, Add Default Control Points. So when I set this and now insert a new layer, and in the layer switch to Curve Grade, we can see that now the points are automatically added, and of course you can also modify them with the mouse or your pen if you don't want to use the panel for it. I personally prefer to have this option unchecked, so I will uncheck it and delete the layer 2. Next, I show you another way of working with the grading panel. So I'm resetting my curve. So within the default mode with the left trackball, here you can see that yellow line moving. So with this one, I can set the target position of a new point. I move it somewhere where I want to add a new point. Then I hit the Add Point key on just above that trackball. And now with the right trackball, I can move that point upwards or downwards. And that trackball, the right trackball, only does movement here on the y-axis. And with the middle trackball, you can do movement on the x-axis. So this is a very precise way that avoids accidental movement on the wrong axis here, for example. And then if I move the left trackball to another position and then add another point, I can then also work with that point, of course. Some people prefer to move multiple curve points at the same time with the panel. And for this, we have an option called Control Point per Trackball Mode. When I check this, so now my leftmost trackball moves here the black point, as you can see, for example. The middle trackball moves the next point on the curve, and the right trackball moves here the highlight point. When I hold down Command or Control, I can change the selection here, for example, of the middle trackball to another point. There are previous and next buttons then available, and so now I can, with the middle trackball, move this point here, for example. Okay, now let's reset that curve here and move on to the RGB curves for that shot. So maybe we keep a small correction here on the shot to adjust the contrast. It looks a little bit bright. All right. So what I can notice here on that shot is that it has a slightly greenish tint. So what we can do is we can go to the green curve and then here add a point somewhere in the center of the curve and, for example, then pull down the green curve a little bit. Here, the overlay of all the 3 color histograms can help with aligning the color channels. So if we're moving the green curve too high, we can also see that now the green channel histogram lives above the other 2 channels, and also we have a strongly green color cast on the image. And so if we want to balance the shot better, we can move that green curve here to a little bit different point. I quickly reset just the green curve to see our before, after, for example. Let's move to the next shot and try something else. So here I want to add a blue color cast to the shadows. So what we could do is we could add one point here somewhere below middle gray onto the blue curve, and below that point we want to raise the blue channel. And what we should see is that now we get that bluish color cast into the shadows that we maybe want to have on that shot. But what we notice is that curve grade tries to maintain always a smooth curve across the whole range. And so by raising the blue here in the shadows, we can see it's also lowering the blue here in the highlights, and that also has an effect on the image. So we can see here the highlights now are getting very yellowish, and so maybe that is something that we don't want in our image. So what can we do about it? So for example, so let's first put our black point also back to original position. So what is controlling the smoothness of the curves is this auto handles option here that we can also uncheck, which I will do in a moment. But first I want to show you another workaround to avoid changing certain parts of the curve, because what the auto handles is doing is only smoothing across the next curve point or control point. So if I'm adding another control point here next to our first one, now what we should see is that above the second point, the curve stays in the identity position. So there's nothing happening at all now, and Baselight only has that small transition area here to smooth the curve basically. We can also zoom in here to see what it's doing. So you should not put these points too close together, otherwise you might end up with a cusp in the curve, but having them in this kind of distance should be pretty safe. So let's undo a few steps. But what you can also do is uncheck the auto handles, and then we will get Bezier handles for each control point. So now we could raise that curve here. And so now you can see above that point, everything stays in identity mode, and we need to manually find a smooth curve that aligns with our creative idea for the shot. Typically, like normal Bezier curves, both handles are manipulated at the same time. Of course, you can also do that via the grading panel, via the rings around the trackballs. And when you hold down Command or Control, then you can also grab just one side of the handles of a control point, but then be careful to not cause any breakups in the image. To have natural looking images, typically we always want to maintain a smooth curve. For now, let's reset the blue curve and move on to the Y or luminance curve. This one uses a color model that logs the chromaticity of the colors for changes on the curve. So you can see that if I'm adding a point here on the curve and changing the contrast of the shot, that the chromaticity stays pretty much locked. Or let's do something like a gain operation here, for example. Notice how the chromaticity on the image stays pretty stable for that kind of operation. And just quickly compare that to a legacy YCBCR operation, a similar one here. If I move the gain, for example, in video grade in YCBCR mode, which still uses legacy Rec 709 math under the hood, but we're now doing that on a scene referred image. You can see that actually doing YCBCR operations on a log image does not really maintain the chromaticity of the colors. So the curve grade method is a much more modern way of doing that. So if you truly want to shape the contrast and tonal response of your images, then this curve here also might be a good solution, and it will then keep the colors, the hues and the saturation locked. So if you add a lot of contrast to the image with this curve, then you will get more into something like a bleach bypass effect here. The most important thing to know about the new Y curve is that you need to keep the black point ideally locked on its position. So never touch the black point on the Y curve. The reason is that close to zero, we're dealing with very high and strange values of saturation, which can easily break the image in that curve. So if you want to lift the black point here, then you should rather do it with the master curve instead. So if you want to have a look with, let's say, lifted blacks, then I suggest using the master curve and then doing the rest of the shaping with the Y curve. I just want to quickly show you what might happen. So now I'm using the master curve and pulling values here below zero. So now if we go into the Y curve and try to bring them up, you can see these color artifacts appearing on the image. So this is something that might happen, and that's why you should either just keep the black point locked. So that's what I'm usually doing, and just do all my other manipulations here, which should work totally fine on the curve. Or another method is, if you're seeing that there are values below zero in the Y curve and you're seeing image break up, then go into the master curve, raise the black point until the shadows here are basically have no values below zero, and then you can also go here into the Y curve and manipulate it without these artifacts. But generally my recommendation is just remember to keep the black point locked for the Y curve, use the rest of the range, and if you want to move the black point, do it in the master curve instead. Now I quickly want to go through some of the other options available in curve grade. So for example, here at the bottom, we have the extended toggle that just zooms out to a very large range, which should usually cover even high dynamic range scenes easily. And with that toggle, you can quickly flip between default range and extended range. Then in the customize menu, we have the histograms. So for the master curve and RGB, you can choose if you want to see output histograms. That means histograms as we use them so far here on the y-axis that adapt to our changes of the curve. Because how the curves work technically is that here on the x-axis we have the input values. So here, for example, middle gray comes in here just below 0.4, hits the curve, and then it's mapped here to that output value on the y-axis. And so if we lower that point here, that means now a value of, maybe let's move it to 0.4. So now a value of 0.4 is now mapped to a value here below 0.4 in the output. So that's how we read these curves. And I think using output histograms for the MRGBY curves is the most useful option. But I also show you the other option, which is input histograms. So now we see our histogram of the image here on the input axis, which is the x-axis. And if we move our curve, we can see that the histogram stays locked because it just shows the input values, but not the output values. Some people might prefer to work like that. Another useful option here on the bottom is the highlight pick. We can turn on that toggle. Now, if we go into the image and pick somewhere, it highlights the range that we currently picked. So here, so this is something in the highlights, and then let's pick something darker. So this is the range here on that curve in the shadows. And of course, this works across all the curves in Curve Grade. With the pick mode, you can set this to select center, for example. Then you can pick a range in the image, and Baselight will put automatically a point here at the center of the range, and also it will then restrict the range with neighboring points. Here we already had one on the curve, so it only put one here. Let's quickly reset. If we set this to range, and here set something for our grass, then Baselight will put 4 points and automatically select the 2 inner ones. So then basically we can move that whole range of that curve then up and down. But that's not so useful, I think, for the MRGBY curves. Let's set that back to disabled. If you prefer the old layout of the curves, you can also do that. You can say here, for example, uncheck single graph layout, and you will have always a zoom in on the currently selected control point. You can then also move it in that view here. But personally, I much prefer the single graph layout because it's so powerful now. And here it's now also very convenient to zoom into a single point. If you want to move that, you can also easily do it here and then quickly home zoom out back to the full graph. Another option is fitting the height of the panels. So now they are not so high and more fit into the UI, but again, I think most people will prefer the single graph layout. And the last thing I want to show are 2 more options for the master curve. Here on the bottom, we can see that the default option is having the master curve in absolute mode, which is this mode that we used so far in this session. And I can also set this to master relative. So now the curve stays at 0 for the whole tonal range. But now we could say, for example, yeah, I want to lower my mid-gray here on that image and leave shadows and highlights in their respective positions. So I could add a point here for black, and I add another point in the highlights to protect these parts of the curve. And then I set my point here on middle gray and move that down. And we can see this is applying a relative adjustment to our gradation. The master relative curve works like the exposure tool in film grade, or like an offset on the image. So when we're lowering this here by 0.10, it's then basically offsetting these values here by -10, and in the other way it's going up. So to make it maybe clearer to understand is, so if I just put a single point and move the whole curve up and down, so now I'm really doing something like a film grade exposure on offset operation. And the last curve in comparison, so this is master scale. So this works in a similar way, but here the unity line is 1.0. So here we're doing a gain operation. So now if I'm adding just a single point and moving the whole curve up and down, so this is now, as you can see here on the image, this is now working like a gain operation on the image. But notice is that it's not doing it in the log stack color space, but it's doing it in that optimized relaxed log. So the blacks are not easily getting pushed below 0 here, although we are working in a scene referred log space. And of course here you would then also do relative adjustments. So the similar thing. So if we want to keep our black point and our highlight point, then we can gain down basically our mid-gray here to darken these areas of the tonal range. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show today. I hope you could see what a precise tool Curve Grade can be on an image and what kind of precise adjustments you can do with it, and also how well we integrated it into other color management of Baselight. And I really believe this is the best Curve Grade that we ever had, and which is maybe not hard compared to the previous one, which did not have so many fans, but it really became a great tool, and I hope that you will enjoy using it as much as I do. Having this new color model is really exciting in Curve Grade. So if you ever worked on a scene referred project and you wished, oh, why can't I do like a Rec 709 style lift gamma gain tweak on the image now? Now with curve grade, you're getting pretty close in that regard. So I really encourage you to try it out. And yeah, and I hope that most of you are already using Baselight version 6 and the other ones are joining soon. And so I say bye-bye, thanks for watching, and see you for the next one. Bye.